over the last 12 months or so, a great reawakening has been happening in the consciousness of sports fans. Some are just now discovering that female college and professional players can generate significant revenues for both their schools and employers and themselves, and that understanding is growing. The television eyeballs for the recent WNBA Championship Series broke records. Game 2 alone averaged almost 800,000 viewers on ESPN. After 25 years, the game has arrived both as a social media influencer and finally receiving some of the respect it has long been denied by broadcasters and marketers. College basketball has benefited from the same ecosystem. The 2021 Women's Final Four championship game averaged over 4 million viewers, despite much controversy surrounding the treatment of women athletes when it came to comparing facilities and access to the men. So what will it take for the college athletic departments to both accept and adjust to this new world order, that some women's sports should be treated as substantial revenue-generating sports? I have just the expert to tackle this question. David Berri is a sports economist and a professor at Southern Utah University. Known by his Twitter handle, Wages of Wins, David is an outspoken advocate for the underserved and underappreciated potential in women's athletics. David is also a contributor to my new book, Sport Finance, Where the Money Comes From and Where the Money Goes, authoring a fantastic chapter on the comparisons between the financial growth of the NBA and the WNBA. Hey, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about the growth trends in women's basketball. It seems as if 2021 is the year that turned the corner. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I don't know that it's turned the corner as much as it's just a continuation of growth. If you go back into the revenue data, women's basketball about 20 years ago, according to the Department of Education, was generating collectively in Division I about $300 million in revenue. Now it's close to $1 billion. Women's basketball today is about what men's basketball was 20 years ago in terms of revenue. And so if we think of men's basketball 20 years ago as major revenue producing sport, that's what we think, and I think people think that, then we would think today that women's basketball is a major revenue generator. Now, they're not treated that way. We saw with the whole weight room issue at the tournament that the NCAA doesn't treat them like they're major revenue producing. And also that we know that revenue would be a lot higher if the NCAA was better at negotiating deals, and they don't do that. But there is a very active fan base. They get pretty big crowds for their games. The ratings for the tournament are pretty high. So it's certainly growing, which is exactly what you'd expect to have happen. Women's sports is obviously held back by a history of discrimination. And so Title IX starts to change that, but Title IX is only 50 years ago. It takes decades to build fan bases. And so women's sports is just getting to a point where they've been around long enough to build any kind of fan base. What we're seeing with women's basketball, and also if you look at women's tennis, women's sports do build fan bases similar to what we saw in men's sports if you give them enough time, which is exactly what you would think would happen. And that's, I think, is a really optimistic story because it tells us that in another 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the WNBA will start to look like the NBA, and National Women's Soccer League will look like the major men's soccer leagues. And that's where all this is going. But it just takes time for the fan bases to build up because fandom is inherited typically from parents. And if the parents weren't fans, then you're probably not going to be fans either. It's hard for adults to become fans. It's a little bit like, because fandom is an addiction, right? I mean, that's what it really is. You're addicted to these things. You can't stop thinking about it. You spend a lot of your time. It's really quite bizarre, right? Because when your team wins, you're happy. And when your team loses, you're sad, but you didn't participate in any of this, right?
Right.
So your life before and after the game is exactly the same. And yet the outcome of the game affects your mood for the rest of the day. And you're like, and for some people, a lot longer than that. And you're like, but you weren't actually involved in that. that was, and sports fans say it like that, right? We won. Well, there's no we, they won. And this is something I think a lot of fans don't appreciate. The participants in the contest don't seem to have the same level of emotional attachment as the fans do.
It's too
So
early.
yes, somebody told me this story once. They went to a Red Sox game, and of course Red Sox, and they're playing the Yankees, and that's a huge rivalry, right? So the Red Sox fans are very into this. He said after the game, I went to a restaurant, and there were the Red Sox and Yankees players eating together. You're like, but I thought they hate each other. Well,
Yeah,
they
they're
don't
supposed
hate
to
each
hate
other.
each other, right? Exactly.
They don't
No,
hate
no,
each
no.
other. They are more than willing to
Associates.
switch teams if you pay them. They don't care what. It's like it's just a uniform. It's whatever. You're a Yankee, okay?
Exactly. Well, and,
And
and
that's
you and I spent a few minutes just before we started talking about our mutual dedication to our original home football teams, which for you is Detroit Lions, for me is the Philadelphia Eagles. We're both despondent over how bad they are this year, but we still talk about them.
of course I spend a lot of my time thinking about it, and and that's the thing, and that kind of a fandom. My Lions fandom begins as a child. I grew up in Detroit. I was taught to be a Lions fan, and that's the team that I've always followed. Even as my family left Detroit and we went other places, I kept following the Lions. That's my team. And I've tried in my life to switch because it would be beneficial to me to switch from the Lions. Lions don't win. I should follow somebody who wins once in a while. It would have been great had when I came to Southern Utah, which is not very far from Phoenix, Arizona, if I became an Arizona Cardinals fan. They are 7-0 right now. If I were an Arizona Cardinals fan, I would be ecstatic right now. But I'm not an Arizona Cardinals fan. I can't follow them. I don't have any history with them. And so it's like I can't develop any more than a casual interest in the teams around me because I don't have that history. And so therefore I don't know the players, and I can't put what I'm seeing in context. This is a big part of fandom, going back to women's sports. A lot of fandom is when you're watching an event right now, you're thinking about how does that compare to something I saw 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so when you think about the NBA, LeBron James has significance because there was Michael Jordan, and Michael Jordan had significance because there was Dr. J, and Dr. J had significance because there was Elgin Baylor. But if you go back to Elgin Baylor, early 1960s, he's playing before 3,000 or 4,000 fans. There's nobody watching him because there are no NBA fans. There's no history with that. And so if you're going back to the 1950s, you say Lakers are going to play Celtics. Fans would go, what exactly is a Laker and what is a Celtic? Why, and for one thing, it's not Celtic, it's Celtic. Okay, let's just be honest about this.
Right,
you mispronounce this word consistently. It's Celtic, not Celtic. And why did you name your basketball team after a British tribe from 2,000 years ago? Thanks. Were they playing basketball at Stonehenge? What exactly is the connection here? Are you just picking random words?
Yeah.
And so the fans don't have any reference point to put what they're watching into perspective, and so that diminishes greatly the interest. You flash forward today, when the Lakers today play the Celtics today, a lot of the fans, what they're watching in their head, this is Magic Johnson and Larry Bird.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, there is no Magic on the floor and there's no Larry on the floor. Yeah, but it's kind of the same thing though, isn't it? It's the Celtics, and it's a weak rivalry. Okay, none of these players were involved in any of that rivalry.
We're building that. We're building that with women's sports now. We might be in a second or third generation of women athletes that we're familiar with. If we think about it in terms of women's basketball, we might go back to Nancy Lieberman, Ann Donovan and Ann Myers, who were sort of the first generation of semi-professional basketball players. And now you look at Paige Buellers or Paige Buckets, who's coming out of UConn, and how well those athletes are doing. So you can feel if you
exactly.
Yeah.
And if you put that in perspective, Nancy Lieberman and Ann Donovan are essentially George Mikan, right? They're at the very beginning, or even before George Mikan, right? And so you're at the very, very beginning, and it's really hard for fans to start to grasp onto that. Now, today, I think what you're looking at with WNBA players are really the equivalent of Oscar Robertson or maybe Bill Russell, those kind of players. And so right now, those players don't have huge fan bases relative to what we're going to see in 30 years. But 30 years from now, they have a big enough fan base that 30 years from now, you're going to see stories written about. They're going to say about this woman playing basketball, and they're going to say, she's like Candace Parker. And then older people like us are going to go, well, that's just bullshit. There's no way in the world that's Candace Parker. I saw Candace Parker play, and I don't know who the hell this person's nowhere near Candace Parker. Candace Parker would dribble circles around this person.
Right.
And those are the kind of conversation you have. The same kind of conversation you have today when people say, LeBron's better than Michael Jordan. And people are like, okay, that's nuts. Michael Jordan was God, and LeBron's just some dude, right? And so you see that, but that's history gives you that, and those conversations are what makes the sport experience what it is. If you try to do all these events totally in isolation, where it's just a competition between two teams that nobody can recognize, that's what the National Women's Soccer League is right now, right? It's we know some of the players, but the problem becomes when you put them on teams. When Rapinoe plays for the Seattle Reign, okay, people are like, well, I know who that is. What's a Seattle Reign?
Right.
And it's like and they're playing the Portland Thorn. Well, is that a rivalry game? Is that an important game? Is there some kind of history there? And it's like, I don't have any context as a fan to know what it is I'm watching. And so I can watch the player. That's great. I like the player, but I don't know what the contest is about. And
so let me ask you this. So if I'm somebody who, as a president or somebody who's vested interest in trying to grow revenues for my athletic department, I may oversee the athletics department. And I recognize that there's real growth opportunity here for women's sports in college athletics. What kinds of things could I do to help accelerate that process, do you think, on my campus?
Yeah, see, that's a great question, isn't it? We know the history of the men's sports, and they didn't accelerate. So we know they didn't do it. we know there never was any acceleration. Yeah, so it's like, so they're like, what can we do to accelerate this? Well, we know the history, and there wasn't. So the NBA started in 1946. 25 years into its existence, it still was drawing less than 10,000 fans a game. That was 25 years later. Nobody saw Oscar Robertson play. Nobody saw Bill Russell play. Will Chamberlain scored 100 points in a game in 1962 when the NBA was 15 years old. And the league at that point, and he played that game in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the reason why it was in Hershey and not Philadelphia, where we played for, is because they were just desperate to find fans anywhere. They're just playing in random places. And that was a big part of the fandom of what they were doing. And so we know they did that. We know they moved the games around. Did that help? Not really. It didn't make a lot of difference. So we know they did try certain things that didn't seem to work.
We have all these media platforms, all these ways to engage with fans, and new ways to measure that engagement. So is it something we could do to jumpstart?
Maybe see, and that's a big thing. So that was the whole big part of that interview I gave with Bloomberg, and they were talking about that. So now that there's social media and we can track these things and we can look at these things, we do know this: women's sports fans are different than men's sports fans, in that because women face this history of discrimination, both in terms of historically banning it, but also the fact that the sports media doesn't give them any coverage, and they don't get the public investment, and they don't get the private investment. So they're discriminated on all these different levels. And women's sports fans have had to learn how to be technologically savvy, because you got to find where the games are. You got to find where the coverage is. You got to look for these things. And so you can take advantage of that. The fact that these are more sophisticated fans, and you can reach out to them. What I think there's a tendency to try and focus on the players. Maybe if we can connect you to players. Now there's some validity to that. Women's tennis does really well. Women's, if you look at mixed martial arts and boxing, does really well. And that's because people can form an emotional attachment to a person very quickly. So you can build a fan base that way. And I think that's kind of what they're trying to do with this. What is it called? Athletes United?
The data sports innovation, is it the sports information data company?
No, it's the new league that they created, Athletes United.
Oh,
They have lacrosse, they have softball, and they have so they're trying to create a league where the focus is on the players, and they have player rankings and not on the teams. The teams are random. And maybe that'll work. Maybe that'll work, because there is a lot of evidence that people connect to players. But if you're going to build a traditional sports league, and that's true for colleges and for professional. So if you're going to build a college sports team, it's the team they're rooting for, not the players. You're going to have to find a way to emotionally connect those fans to the team. Now, colleges have an advantage. Their alumni are already emotionally attached to them. And so I know if you're a Nebraska fan, that when the women play volleyball or the women play basketball, you already have a fan base that's interested in the outcome. They already know who they're rooting for when they see the game. That makes a huge difference. So that's why college sports does better than the professional sports at this point, because the fan base exists. If you're going to do it at the professional level, at some point you're going to have to build an emotional attachment to these teams, and the teams only exist in our minds. There is no such thing as a Seattle Reign. There's no such thing as a Minnesota Lynx. And so you got to somehow connect in your brain, I'm a fan of this thing that doesn't really actually exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wish I knew some way to make that happen for people.
Well, one of the things that it strikes me as where senior leaders might be able to help with this is that we tend to focus on the only game or event that can unify our alumni is if we have a homecoming weekend around football. And schools, particularly that don't have football teams on their campuses, I think really struggle with trying to create a unifying event. Can we ever get away from the idea that we have to have football on campus to be able to pull everybody together? It seems like old thinking.
Okay, you definitely could do that for every single one of your sports. You could do that. I think, one thing that you want to do, I would imagine, is reach out to your alumni and emphasize what you're doing in other sports. Don't just talk about football. Because the fan base, again, exists. They're going to root for their school. If you tell them there's something to root for, that would help. And so it does go back to marketing efforts. How much marketing are you putting into this? Are you putting most of your marketing effort into football and men's basketball? I would emphasize to athletic directors in terms of revenue potential going forward. There probably isn't going to be a whole lot of growth in football and men's basketball. But there is a lot of growth in women's sports. So if you're looking at where you should put your marketing dollars, market the women's sports, because that's where you're going to see the growth. You have a lot of fans out there, dude, that haven't been converted yet, and you can convert them because you're a college and they're already converted to your organization. And so, you would find there would be a lot of crossover, but you have to convince the athletic directors to do that. And there is an impediment to this, because the athletic director knows their job depends on football and men's basketball. That's why you see such odd, these USA Today's written about this, and I've been interviewed for these kind of stories. My favorite example of this is University of Arizona. Arizona announced last October, we have budget cuts. COVID has just devastated our budget. We got to cut budgets. So we're going to cut these positions, marketing positions, stats positions, these people who make $80,000 a year. And then Arizona goes against Arizona State in a football game, biggest game of the year for the Arizona fans, and they lose like 70-10. And then 2 days later, the athletic goes, we got to fire that football coach.
Right.
And you're like, okay, to fire a head football coach is going to cost you, millions of dollars. Yeah. But you didn't have millions of dollars. You didn't have $100,000 to pay this marketing person. Yeah, but I now have millions of dollars to fire that football coach. Well, why is that? Well, here's the deal. If we don't fix the football team, they're going to fire me next. So you're gone. I got millions of dollars to pay for that. No alumni are calling me to save the marketing person, but they're definitely calling me about this football game because that was horrible.
Yeah, and
you can imagine how many phone calls and text messages the athletic director and the university president at Arizona got during that game.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure this is a total humiliating disaster, and it's your fault.
Yeah,
and you got all these alumni, and that's the weird thing about fandom. You have all these alumni whose entire life is being devastated because 19, 20-year-old football players didn't perform well.
Yeah.
And they're like, I can't believe this is happening to me. And you're like, okay, it's not happening to you. You're not playing this game. And what difference does it make?
Yeah.
Oh, it's, and that's how these sports fans are. We once had, I don't know if you remember the player, Paul Shirley. He was a star basketball player at Iowa State. And then he played in the NBA briefly and played overseas. He wrote a book called Can I Keep My Jersey? About his, it's a very humorous book about his time in professional basketball, but I had him on the SU campus. And he told me once, he said, it was really bizarre when I was starring at Iowa State. You'd look up in the stands and these old men were just incredibly irate and angry over what we were doing. And I'm thinking to myself, dude, we're 20 years old. I mean, we're not going to win every game, but sometimes we lose. And I often tell, athletes, but I have student athletes in my class, I go, I am shocked when I'm watching a college football game that any of the plays go well, because I have these students in my class and they're not getting it. What do you mean you knew the play? You didn't know this? I told you that 5 times.
That's really
well, on this play, I know I'm doing that. How do you remember all that? You can't remember this thing in the class. And it's like, and these announcers are like, I don't understand why he didn't know to keep with that guy. Well, I had him in class and he couldn't remember the Civil War came after the Revolutionary War. So I'm not surprised he couldn't figure this part out.
But you bring up a good point, is that we end up cutting pennies and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on things that really demonstrate what our values are. And I guess what we need to do, and one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you is help people understand that if you're chasing new dollars, if that's really what you need to do, then women's sports has value for you and has
exactly. And that's everything.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The problem is getting those athletic directors to shift their focus.
That's it. Yes,
it is their jobs depend on these things. And the thing is what you saw with COVID was the same thing we've seen with Title IX for 50 years, is that they will cut men's programs and then they'll blame something else rather than say what they're doing. And what they're doing is, I need the money to spend on football and men's basketball. And you're like, and I don't want to say that because, I don't want to say I cut men's gymnastics for my football team. So what I do is I say, I cut men's gymnastics because Title IX made me.
That's right. So let me ask you a question about this word value. When people are trying to value how much to spend on broadcast rights for a particular event or a particular season, how do you value women's sports when the traditional metric has been, broadcast linear television viewers? So we're trying to look at it from a perspective of all the different ways that women's sports fans engage, whether it be on Twitter or on Snapchat or Instagram, or buying, NIL valued products. How do we measure value? Help people understand what that means in terms of seeing.
Well, yeah, that's the really hard part, because the traditional measures are going to focus on the traditional broadcasting, and that right. is, and that again, these are more technologically sophisticated fans, so they're probably not going to be watching in ways that you can measure as you've done in the past. The men, if you're watching men's sports, you don't have to try very hard. You can watch it on your local, Dish Network, cable TV. It's very easy. But if you're watching women's sports, a lot of it's going to be online. A lot of and women's sports fans get used to that.
Yeah.
So even if it is available in the broadcasting arena, they may still be watching it online because they're just used to doing it that way.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for you to capture those things. That makes things a lot more difficult for you to measure what the engagement is. And it requires that you be actually more sophisticated in how you measure these things. Of course, if you don't want to measure it in the first place, you certainly are going to make any effort to be sophisticated in how you're doing it. So a lot of what we see in women's sports is men doing self-fulfilling prophecies. They look at the data that confirms what they want to see in the first place.
Yeah.
A lot of these, the fact of the matter is, I think if you were to do a survey of athletic directors and ask them, what is your favorite sport? Why did you get into athletic administration? They would tell you it's football and men's basketball. In fact, many of them are alumni of football and men's basketball. That's what they think is their primary mission.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well then that's why you're not putting money into these things.
I wrote my dissertation. I wrote it on the launch of the Big Ten Network. I wanted to understand the thinking and the administrative decision-making behind, gathering all your media rights for the conference and putting them in one place, and then trying at that point to be 50% women's sports and 50% men's sports. They made it very clear that that's what they were going to be about. And I interviewed Mark Silverstein, who was the head of the Big Ten Network at that point. And I said to him, Mark, how are you going to accomplish this? Because there's not enough football and men's basketball games to keep every fan watching. He goes, no. We're going to get people to buy into their school programs. So if you're an Indiana football fan, then we expect you're going to want to be an Indiana fan across all of the sports that we broadcast. And we're going to set up Indiana days or Iowa days or Nebraska days or those types of things. And we hope that we'll keep people engaged. Well, after about 4 years, they figured out that wasn't working. So now what's happened is that content has shifted off to the BTN Plus, to the streaming, and everything else is kind of like the pre-football game, the pre-football game coaches show, that post game, and all the different wrap-ups and highlights and everything around football, because people just weren't following it. Do you see a shift there?
Well, that's the problem. Now, how much time do they give it? 4 years. Well, I'm sorry, you can't
Yeah.
build up anything in 4 years. That's not going to
Yeah.
happen. So it's
Right.
like, you want to do something, you want to build up a fan base, and I got to do it in 4 years.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem with when men are doing this. It's like
Yeah.
they have no sense of the history. If the men who behave the way they do with respect to women's sports, they did this respect to men's sports, there would be no NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball. They would have all gone out of business because they didn't make any money for decades, and they would have all given up. They said, "There's no money in this. Why am I doing this?" And all we would have today is college sports, because the professional sports never would have got off the ground. But instead, men, and I use this phrase a lot: men love investing in men. Men love men. When it comes to sports, men love men, and they really do love men. And so they pour money into it, and they pour coverage into it. This is the biggest thing they do. And then when it comes to women's sports, they're like, we tried something and it didn't work. Oh, I'm sorry.
They give up
That's
on
not
it
how this
after one
works.
time. It's absolutely stunning to me that happens. I did read something the other day. Maybe you wrote it on Twitter about the Rooneys and the Pittsburgh Steelers.
That was the
And
Bloomberg story.
how long
I
they've.
love that story. That's the Bloomberg story. I love that story. It's one of my favorites.
Yes, go ahead. Tell it the story. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think I told this story. Ivan Kelly, Victor Matheson, and I wrote a book on the economics of the Super Bowl, and I might have written it in there. If not, I'm working on a book on women in sports with Nev Walker, and it'll be in there. But I told this story to Bloomberg because I love this story. And so Art Rooney, it's 1933. The NFL at this point is about 12 years old. They have completely failed. They've had, well over 40 different franchises have entered into the NFL at some point in the last 12 years. 90% of them completely went out of business. So it is in 1933 we're in the middle of the Great Depression. So this is like, NFL's a failed business. There isn't any demand for it. There's no television. All of their revenue is from the gate. Football is a lousy spectator sport. It's cold. You can't see the field. It's just horrible as a spectator sport. It works, and this is why when you go see a Cowboys game today, you notice in the stadium, you're not seeing the field. There's a big giant screen that goes for 100 yards. Yes. What they're watching is the biggest sports bar ever. and down there below is a little tiny field, and you know that what you're seeing on that screen is down there, but you can't see any of that. It's like, well, I guess they're down there. They're down there someplace, but you can't see any of it.
Right.
And so that's the NFL. It's just not a very good business. But Art Rooney loves football and he wants to be involved. And somehow he had $15,000. Now, this is not a very successful businessman. He's not a very rich man. He's not a Rockefeller, but he's got $15,000, which is a pretty good sum of money in 1933. And he decides to plunge it all into the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, so he forms this football team, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, that's great. He then weathers the rest of the 1930s. He goes through World War II, where the players all leave. He continues to invest in this. He comes out of World War II, and he keeps putting money into this. And this is not even a good football team. For the first 40 years that Rooney owns the Steelers, they went to one playoff game against your Philadelphia Eagles, and they scored no points. So for 40 years, Art Rooney puts money into the Steelers. He doesn't make money. He doesn't see any winning, and he keeps doing it because he loves football. Right. And then finally, when he's an old man, they get lucky in the draft. They draft a bunch of Hall of Famers in the early 1970s. And of course, it was totally by luck because there's no way in the world they knew any of this stuff. But it turns out they got really lucky, and they drafted a bunch of people, and suddenly he has a Super Bowl team, and he gets to see his team win a Super Bowl. And then his grandson eventually inherits his team, and now in 2020, as Bloomberg pointed out, the team is worth $3.5 billion. So that $15,000 investment becomes a $3.5 billion franchise. Well, 90 odd years later. And so his grandson is tremendously grateful that his grandfather did all that for all those, because you can imagine, for 40 years, his team is traveling by bus. He doesn't have any money. He's just throwing money down this pit. He's not a rich guy. He's part of this league that's not going anywhere. It doesn't have very many fans. They don't get much coverage from the media. And then his grandson inherits this $3.5 billion franchise. I imagine his grandson lives in a far bigger house than his grandfather ever lived in. And he gets to sit in the owner's box and watch his team play before, hundreds of thousands of fans every year. And he gets to say, isn't this great? Yeah, you inherit this because your grandfather did that for 40 years, which was stupid. If you went back and said, okay, let's look at this from a financial perspective. Is this worth your investment? No. The money you're throwing into this isn't going anywhere. But he kept doing it. And eventually he builds this fan base that is, he gets a large number of people addicted to his team. And now he's got this fan base that just keeps giving him money. And the thing about it is, what's really cool about addiction is they keep giving him money even if the product's no good. See, that's the cool thing. Eagles fans and Lions fans,
it's a tradition, yeah.
They will keep going to the games and keep giving those owners money, even though they're giving them a product that they don't like.
Yeah.
My favorite Lions story is when they were 0-16 that year. There were people who showed up to Lions games in the jerseys of the opposing team as a protest.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, yeah, but you still gave them money to get into the what do they care?
I want the right to complain. I want the right to complain.
But that would be like going to a McDonald's and ordering McDonald's food, but wearing a Burger King t-shirt. It's like, I don't care what t-shirt you wear. You're here at McDonald's.
You're giving me money. That's right. That's right.
It's like, that's not a protest. What do you see? I'm wearing a Burger King t-shirt. So I like Burger King better, but you're at a McDonald's.
Okay. My last question for you, and this has been a great conversation, but I want you to look into your crystal ball a little bit. And I was going to ask you about the NCAA breaking up, but I'm really thinking more about Angel City, the new franchise in the NWSL in Los Angeles that's going to break. And it's got all of these incredibly well-known women investors that are plunging, I don't know how much money in, but they have more money than they probably know what to do with. They have so many people investing. Where do you see that franchise going at this point? What do you think?
It was a big part of the Bloomberg story, and I loved their enthusiasm. I thought it was great. They pointed out in the story we signed exactly one player.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Like, okay, you're going to actually have to build a roster.
You are going to have to do that.
At some point, it's great. You're doing the investment and you're doing the community engagement, and that's all fantastic.
Yes.
But at some point, it is a sports team. You'll have to acquire players and coaches, and you'll have to do all those things.
Yes.
And you're going to have some level.
A friend of mine is the head coach, so there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to do all those things. And even though you've done all those things and you've had all that investment, I'm sorry, it's a brand new sports league. It is going to take time to build up a fan base. And I love the fact that all those women are enthusiastic about this. But again, I really hope they think about that Art Rooney story. You want to be Art Rooney. This is a 50-year adventure. In 50 years, you got to think about 50 years. I don't want you should not be looking at your profit statements for the next 10 years. You should think 50 years from now, what's this going to be? And so, yes, you're right. Serena Williams, you're not going to see this. Your kids or your grandkids might appreciate your investment. You are probably never going to appreciate this because it's just going to take so long for you to get a fan base that's going to be addicted to what you're offering them. And you can do all the community engagement you want and stuff, and that's all fantastic. But at the end of the day, it's going to take you time to build that up. And until that time passes, again, I would like to think there's some shortcut to build a fan base. I just know from men's sports history, they never found one.
Yeah.
So maybe there is one. Maybe we'll find it. But it seems to me that addiction takes time to build.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier for children to build up that addiction than it is for adults. It goes back to, you think about something as simple as whether you drink Coke or Pepsi. Whether you're a Coke fan or a Pepsi fan or neither was established when you were a kid. It was not established when you were adult. Nobody at 30 picks up a Coke and goes, "Oh, Coke. Oh, I hadn't thought about that." I'm sorry. By then you've already had Coke and you've already decided, like it, don't like it, I'm indifferent.
Right.
And that's already been decided. And no amount of advertising by Coke at 30 is going to change that preference.
That's right.
And I think it's very similar as a sports fan. I've become sports fans of things. I'm a Minnesota Lynx fan. But frankly, I'm a Minnesota Lynx fan because I know people with Minnesota Lynx. It's
That's
made a
right.
huge difference.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
that's made a huge difference. That's a totally, I've talked to Cheryl Reeve, so I know what I'm rooting for. I don't know that I could become a huge fan in the same way I'm a Lions fan at my age, because I don't have any history with it. And so it becomes more difficult to build up those fan bases. It's really something you want little kids to do. So maybe that's the secret. Maybe the secret is Angel City's just got to throw money into getting as many kids at these games as you possibly can. Get them, give out free merchandise to kids. There it is. I solved the problem. Okay, I didn't know the answer 20 minutes ago. I came up with the answer. So this is the great example of tall white male confidence. So I don't know the answer 20 minutes ago, but now I have the answer. Get the little kids addicted. So there you go. There you go. I solved your problem for you. Let me tweet that out. I'll contact the Angel City people. I figured out your problem for you. Well done. I'm glad I could fix your problem for you. Let me know if you need anything else.
Well, David Berri, I really want to thank you for making this an enjoyable conversation. It's a tough conversation, but it's important to know. And I think our bottom line, our takeaway is you have to give everything time, because nothing's going to be able to speed things up. So it just takes time.
And get little kids addicted. That's my other thing. Get the little kids addicted. So hang out at parks and hand out jerseys if Angel City did them and go.
Well, thank you so much.
Being an Angel City fan?
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. That was really great. Thank you.
It was fun.